Partnerships and similar channels to Horizon 2020 funding. Much of Horizon 2020 budget is administered by the European Commission together with its executive agencies. Usually, the European Commission, the EC, defines the work programme, the 2,000-page document which details the scope of project proposals which might be funded and which is updated every 2 years. The Commission, or its agencies, then organise calls for proposals, appoint experts to evaluate the proposals, and award grants. Later, they monitor the progress of funded projects and make the corresponding payments. But for over 20% of the Horizon 2020 budget, some of the functions of the Commission and its agencies are carried out by other bodies through a range of partnership agreements. This webcast will give an overview of the partnerships and how they operate. There are 4 main types of partnerships through which Horizon 2020 funding can be channelled. The first are Joint Technology Initiatives, or JTIs. These are partnerships between the EU and industry-led consortia with long-term programmes of research in specific sectors. With the EU, they establish a joint undertaking which awards grants. They have a budget from Horizon 2020 of over €7 billion. Next are CPPPs, Contractual Public-Private Partnerships between the EU and industry-led groupings which define work programme content in specific areas of Horizon 2020, with a budget again of over €7 billion. Third comes public-public partnerships between the EU, member states and associated countries, often abbreviated to P2Ps. They jointly fund research which these countries prioritise through dedicated implementation structures which award grants. Funding from Horizon 2020 is about €1.5 billion. Finally, there is COFUND, the short name for Programme Co-Fund Action. According to the legislation setting up Horizon 2020, this means an action funded through a grant, whose purpose is to supplement individual calls or programmes funded by organisations managing research and innovation programmes, other than the EU funding bodies. Together, these partnerships are responsible for about 22.5% of the Horizon 2020 budget. The baseline for describing the partnerships is the EC's usual processes in spending the Horizon 2020 budget, for which the EC has full responsibility. It starts with the development of the work programme. Advice is sought from many sources within and outside of the EC. Eventually, the final draft is presented to the Programme Committee, composed of representatives of the EU member states. The next step is to issue a call for proposals. This may be done by the EC itself, but in many cases the task is transferred to its agencies. The call for proposals is published on the EC's participant portal at the web address shown here. Then, they appoint experts to evaluate the proposals. Based on the evaluation, the EC or its agencies select the proposals which will be awarded grants. Later, they monitor progress of the funded projects and make the corresponding payments. The joint technology initiatives follow the same process. While the EC retains responsibility for ensuring the money is spent correctly, the JTIs take over defining the content of the work programme in their area of interest. They also organise the calls for proposals, appoint experts to judge the proposals, award grants and monitor their progress. They do this through joint undertakings, legal entities set up for this purpose which are supervised by representatives of the private sector and the European Commission. They are shown in this table as JTI-JU. JTIs are only established by agreement at the highest level in the EU, the European Parliament and the Council of Ministers. To gain their approval, the industry-led consortia must first make the case for public funding, and this is based on a strategic research agenda which identifies research priorities in their area of interest. Once this is approved, the JTI develops more detailed plans each year, which are the equivalent of the work programme. These annual plans are called work plans. Of course, it's money that makes all this work. The Commission annually commits funds from the Horizon 2020 budget. Industry commits substantial additional resource in up to 3 ways. Firstly, co-financing their participation in projects that are awarded Horizon 2020 grants. EU funding never covers the full cost of these projects. Secondly, by participating without EU funding in projects which are awarded Horizon 2020 grants. Or thirdly, by carrying out additional work outside the annual work plan but contributing to the JTI's strategic research agenda. This table shows the financial commitments which the JTIs agree to make net of any grant they receive. For example, the major air industry companies that established the Clean Sky Initiative agreed to spend over €2 million co-financing EU-funded projects and undertaking additional work to achieve the programme's objectives. IMI, the Innovative Medicines Initiative, was set up by major pharmaceutical companies chiefly to overcome bottlenecks in the process of drug discovery. The companies guaranteed to contribute over €1.6 billion, either in cash or through participating in funded projects without receiving any of the grant funding themselves. Each JTI has negotiated its own financial commitments, which are legally binding. If not achieved, the EC can reduce or even terminate its financial contribution. Finally, as mentioned on the footnote to the table, the Excel initiative differs from the others. As well as a financial contribution from the EU, this JTI also receives financial contributions from a number of countries. As a result, its rules can differ from that of the other JTIs. Based on the strategic research agenda, each year the members of the joint undertaking, other than the EU, develop the work plan for the next year. These members could be one or more associations formed specifically for this purpose, or individual organisations named in the agreement establishing the JTI. Sometimes the work of the members is divided between subgroups. A higher level committee then takes their outputs and balances the competing claims for inclusion in the work plan. Their work is compiled into the JTI's work plan by the staff of the joint undertaking, who then sends it to 2 groups for advice, a scientific committee and official representatives of the EU member states and associated countries. The work plan can include topics reserved for the members, but for other topics, places in consortia can be pre-allocated to them. But the plan always includes opportunities for non-members to apply for and obtain grants. All input is then presented to the governing board, who will authorise the final version. The EC, on behalf of the EU and other members of the joint undertaking, are all represented on the board. The EC has 50% of the votes in the decision-making of this board, but decisions normally have to be taken by a majority of 75%. Calls for proposals for the JTIs can be found on the EC's participant portal. Next, we will move on to Contractual Public-Private Partnerships, or CPPPs. These are similar to joint technology initiatives in the sense that they are based on agreements between the public sector and the private sector. The contract between the European Commission and an association representing a sector of the economy is based on a multi-annual roadmap for research and innovation, which fulfills a function similar to the strategic research agendas on which the JTIs are based. CPPPs also take on the task of work programme definition, but that is where the similarities end. The following stages, call for proposals, evaluation, grant agreement and project monitoring, are carried out by the EC and its agencies. In exchange for the privilege of providing inputs to the Horizon 2020 work programme, the private sector makes some financial commitments. Two types are allowed by the contract. First, they co-finance their participation in projects that are awarded Horizon 2020 grants, because the EU funding never covers the full cost of the project. Second, they undertake additional activities outside the Horizon 2020 work programme, but which contribute to the CPPP's objectives. Only the second of these is quantified, as shown in the next table. This table lists the 10 CPPPs launched up to mid-2017. The EU financial contributions shown in the table are to fund topics recommended by the CPPPs, which will be identified in Horizon 2020 work programmes. In each case, the additional investment is a multiple of the EU budget dedicated to CPPP topics in the Horizon 2020 work programme. The additional investments will build on the results of the projects funded by Horizon 2020 to bring them closer to commercialisation and use. The additional investment is less precise than its analogue in the Joint Technology Initiatives. This reflects the nature of the CPPP agreement between the private side and the EU. It is a best efforts agreement, similar to a memorandum of understanding. No liability will arise if the additional investment is not achieved. However, the numbers will be monitored alongside other measurements of performance of the private side. If these targets are not met, then the EC can terminate the agreement. How does the CPPP provide its work programme input to the EC? The answer is the Partnership Board. This is where representatives of the private side meet with EC staff to discuss their ideas for work programme topics. The private side is required to ensure adequate involvement of all relevant stakeholders in the preparation of its inputs to the EC. To achieve this, the private side is organised through an association. Usually, providing input to the Horizon 2020 work programme is the major or only function of this association. While each CPPP can choose how to organise the involvement of stakeholders, most set up working groups around technologies or user sectors. Some have as few as 3, many have between 5 and 10, and one CPPP has 32. Of course, there must be a mechanism to prioritise between the suggestions of the working groups. So usually there is another committee to do this. The CPPPs use many different names for this committee. We've called it Working Programme Input Committee to make its functions clear. Organising the work of these committees, making sure all possible stakeholders are contacted and, as far as possible, engaged in the work of the association requires a lot of effort. This requires staff and other costs, and so the associations charge membership fees. Calls resulting from the work of the CPPPs can be found on the EC's participant portal at the address shown here. And now we come to public-public partnerships. For these, one public is the EU, the other are governments of several countries working together. The aim of a P2P is to coordinate national research funding between these countries and so achieve synergies and reduce duplication. And a small clarification. We've added a subtitle, Article 185, to these P2Ps. This is to distinguish them from the programme COFUND actions, which also involve the EU and governments of individual countries. We will describe the COFUND actions later in this webcast. If we compare the P2P with the normal Horizon 2020 process for awarding grants, then the EC retains responsibility for ensuring the money is spent correctly, but the P2Ps take over defining the content of the work programme in their area of interests. They also organise the calls for proposals, appoint experts to judge the proposals, award grants and monitor their progress. They do this through dedicated implementation structures, legal entities set up for this purpose. They are supervised by the participating states, those countries who have chosen to take part in the P2Ps, with the European Commission as observer. The implementation structures are shown in this table as P2P DIS. Like the joint technology initiatives, P2Ps are established only by agreement at the highest level in the EU, the European Parliament and the Council of Ministers. Once this has been agreed, the P2Ps develop annual plans called work plans, the equivalent of the Horizon 2020 work programmes. This table shows the total funding which the EU and the participating states make available to the P2Ps, which have been established in Horizon 2020 so far. The EU agrees to provide funding over the duration of Horizon 2020, while the participating states provide funding by a combination of money and contributions in kind. The Active and Assisted Living Programme addresses the application of IT and robotics to help older citizens remain in their own homes for a larger part of their lives. Almost all the money contributed by the EU and the participating states is available for research organisations, companies and other organisations to spend primarily on close-to-market innovation projects. The same goes for Eurostars. Except for a small amount of administration, all the money is available for projects which support research-intensive SMEs to work in cross-border collaborations on close-to-market innovation projects. In the area of metrology research, many European countries already have large teams of researchers working in public institutes funded by their governments. Most of the funding through MPEA will be allocated to them, but 15% of the total is available for other teams. In the European and Developing Countries Clinical Trials Programme, European researchers work with sub-Saharan countries to tackle their specific health problems. Many European countries already have substantial publicly funded research programmes addressing this area. The cost of these nationally funded programmes are to an extent included as contributions in kind. So far in Horizon 2020, they account for 60% of the total budget, with the remainder spent through open calls for proposals. Each P2P has negotiated its own financial commitments, which are legally binding. If they are not achieved, the EC can reduce or even terminate its financial contribution. Preparing the annual work plan, the equivalent of Horizon 2020's work programme, follows this procedure. It starts with a dedicated implementation structure, an awkward expression for the not-for-profit associations which manage these programmes. Staff of the associations prepare the initial drafts of the work plans. These describe the topics which might be funded, identifying separately work that constitutes a contribution in kind and so open only to proposals from pre-identified organisations. In most cases, an advisory committee with expertise in the subject addressed by the P2P reviews the draft work plan. With the input from its advisory committee, the governing body of association, its General Assembly, adopts the plan. The General Assembly are normally representatives of the governments of the countries participating in the P2P. But that is not the end of the process. EU money will only be agreed once European Commission staff agree the plan. In practice, EC staff are entitled to attend meetings of the advisory committees and General Assembly. so any difference in views between the different bodies can be resolved through discussion. Calls for proposals to these P2Ps can be found through the web address shown here. Finally, there are programme co-fund actions. These are public-public partnerships in which one public is the EU and the others are governments of individual countries. However, co-fund actions work to a different set of rules from the Article 185 P2Ps described earlier. We mentioned earlier that COFUND directs money to funding agencies in individual countries to supplement their national funding for research, researcher training and innovation. So national funding agencies, NFAs in the table, apply for a Horizon 2020 grant which they add to their own funds in order to provide grants to organisations in their country. The national funding agencies develop the description of the topics to be funded, organise a call of proposals and their evaluation, and award grants and monitor their progress. Five different types of co-fund projects have been supported in the first 3 years of Horizon 2020. In terms of EU funding, the largest is ERANET co-fund. ERANET stands for European Research Area Network. ERANET co-fund supports consortia of national funding agencies to develop and fund a single call for proposals for transnational research or innovation projects. Successful proposers will receive grants from their national funding agencies to carry out their part of the work on the joint project. EU funding is limited to 33% of the costs. The remainder is provided by the national funding agencies. The EU contribution shown here is from data published in mid-2017 for grants awarded in the first 3 years of the programme. The final figure translates the euros into a share of nominal Horizon 2020 budget for those 3 years. EJP Co-Fund is a longer-term version of the ERANET Co-Fund. It lasts up to 5 years and develops annual programmes of research or innovation funding. EJP means European Joint Programme. The funding shown here is for the first action supported under its heading, and is about 7 times the average funding for ERANETs. PCP Co-Fund addresses pre-commercial procurement by public sector bodies, such as health services, and further along the research to innovation chain is PPI Co-Fund, Public Procurement of Innovation Solutions. We've mentioned them only to give a complete view of co-fund actions. Most researchers will never meet this class of EU funding. MSCA Co-Fund is part of the Marie Skłodowska-Curie programme for researcher training within Horizon 2020. Here, a single organisation which funds researcher training and meets EC preconditions can obtain a large grant to multiply the number of researchers it can train. Those who receive this funding include both national funding agencies and individual universities and institutes. Calls for proposals for these co-fund programmes, excluding MSCA, can be found through this web address. We are conscious that this quick tour of partnerships in Horizon 2020 contained large numbers of acronyms, which can be confusing. But as we finish the webcast, we must mention one more. This is ETP, which stands for European Technology Platform. ETPs are voluntary associations focusing on a sector of industry or research. They were introduced in 2002 as a mechanism to provide the EC with the views of industry concerning their research needs. According to the EC, over 40 exist. Many have found an extended role for themselves in the JTIS and CPPPs. Some are founder members of the joint technology initiatives and continue to provide industry views on its research needs. Others have taken on the role of the private side in the contractual PPPs, signing the contract with the EC on behalf of their members. So don't be surprised if the acronym ETP shows up if you interact with these bodies. Some ETPs continue with their original objective and provide their inputs directly to the EC to help define its Horizon 2020 work programmes, along with many other interest groups. But that is another story. Thank you for listening.